It's crazy to think about, right? That there were things that looked like us, or at least like the apes we see in movies, living on this planet millions of years before any human ever drew their first breath. My dad says it's like trying to imagine a color you've never seen. You can talk about it, you can describe it, but you can't really feel it. I guess that's what history is, in a way. You read the facts, you see the pictures, but the real story, the one with the smells, and the sounds and the sweaty palms, that's gone forever. It's buried under a mountain of time. But I like to try. I like to close my eyes and let my mind wander back, way back. Back to a time when the world was different, wilder. Back to a place called Ouranopithecus. The name sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, doesn't it? Ouranopithecus. It rolls off your tongue like the name of a forgotten king. My dad told me it means Uranus ape, or ape from Uranus, because they found the first bones near a place called Ouranos in Greece. It's a cool name for a really, really old ape, like 11 million years old. That's a number my brain can't even hold. I can count to 1,000, maybe even a few thousand, but 1,000,000? It's just a word. It's like saying infinity or forever. It doesn't mean anything real. But 11 million years ago, a real ape, not a human, was living, breathing, and trying to survive. Imagine the world then. The sun was hot. The sky was a deep, impossible blue. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and strange flowers. The land was a patchwork of dense, humid forests and open, grassy plains. In this world, there was a family of apes, not so different from a family today. There was a father, a mother, and a young one, maybe my age. I call him Kale. I don't know his real name, of course. No one does. But in my head, he's Kale. Kale wasn't a human, but he wasn't a gorilla either. He was something in between, a bridge across an ocean of time. He was an Ouranopithecus. He had a strong jaw, powerful teeth, and a brow ridge that looked like a permanent scowl. His face wasn't flat like ours. It jutted out, a bit like a baboon's, but his eyes were set forward, giving him a keen, focused gaze. He could see in 3 dimensions, just like us. He was a creature of the forest, a master of the canopy. His days were spent high up, swinging from branch to branch, the wind a constant whisper in his ears. Kale's mother was named Lyra, in my head. Lyra was a small, quick ape, her movements a blur of brown fur and muscle. She was the heart of their little family, always watchful, always caring. Lyra taught Kale everything he needed to know. She showed him which berries were safe to eat and which ones would make his belly ache. She taught him how to crack open a tough nut with a smooth river stone, a skill that took patience and a steady hand. She taught him the language of the forest. The sharp cry of a hawk meant danger from above. The rustle in the undergrowth could be a snake or just a harmless lizard. The world was a book, and Lyra was teaching Kale how to read it. Kale's father, whom I named Theron, was a different kind of teacher. He was big and powerful, a living mountain of bone and muscle. Theron's presence was a force of nature. He was the protector, the shield. When the shadows of the forest grew long and the strange howls of the night creatures began, it was Theron who stood guard. He would sit on a high branch, his back straight, his eyes scanning the darkness. When a threat approached, a growl would rumble in his chest, a sound that seemed to shake the very leaves on the trees. Theron taught Kale the hard lessons. He showed him how to defend his family, how to show strength without violence, and how to understand the unspoken rules of their world. He taught Kale the importance of his family, of his tribe. He taught him that they were not alone. There were others, and they were all connected, a living, breathing network woven into the very fabric of the forest. Their home was in the heart of what would one day become a part of a country called Greece. But back then, there were no countries, no borders, no names. There was just the land, the sky, and the endless cycle of life and death. The climate was warmer than it is today, and the land was a mosaic of different landscapes. The forests were lush and green, filled with ancient trees that reached for the sky. These trees were their highways, their homes, their supermarkets. Kale and his family spent most of their lives up in the branches, safe from the predators that roamed the forest floor. Their days were simple, yet full. They woke with the sun, the golden light filtering through the leaves, dappling the forest floor in a shifting pattern of light and shadow. They would begin their day with a meal of ripe fruit, juicy leaves, and plump insects. Kale's favorite was a certain kind of fig that grew on a tall tree near the river. The figs were sweet and soft, a perfect treat. After eating, they would spend the day traveling, foraging for more food. Lyra would carry Kale on her back, her strong hands gripping the branches, her feet finding purchase on the thickest limbs. Kale would hold on tight, his small hands buried in her thick fur, his face pressed against her back. He felt safe there, protected. But life wasn't always easy. There were dangers, big and small. One day, a huge storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple and black. The wind howled through the trees, a ferocious beast trying to rip them from their roots. Kale was terrified. The branches swayed violently, and the rain came down in sheets, a cold, relentless assault. Theron was at his best during these storms. He found the thickest, most stable branch and settled his family there, his powerful body a barrier against the wind and rain. He didn't make a sound, just sat there, a statue of strength and courage. Kyle watched his father, his fear slowly melting away, replaced by a deep sense of security. He knew that as long as his father was there, they would be okay. Then there were the other animals. The saber-toothed cats, with their long, curved fangs, were the most feared. They were silent hunters, shadows that moved through the forest floor, with a deadly grace. Theron taught Kyle to recognize their scent, a musky, powerful smell that meant to climb higher, to be silent, and to wait. Kale learned that the best defense was to avoid a fight. There were also the crocodiles in the river, their scaled bodies a perfect camouflage. They were a reminder that even the places that seemed safe could be deadly. I think the most interesting thing about Kale, about Ouranopithecus, is that he wasn't a dead end. He was a branch on our family tree, a branch that eventually led to us. He was a link in a long chain, and for a long, long time, his life was the most important story in the world. He was living, breathing proof that our story didn't start with us. It started with a family of apes, high up in the trees, a long, long time ago, in a world that's almost impossible to imagine. It's a story about survival, about family, and about the long, slow, incredible march of time. I like to think about Kale sometimes, sitting there in the warm sun, a ripe fig in his hand, a whole future stretching out before him, a future he could never, ever have imagined. He wasn't a human, but he was a beginning, and that's a story worth telling. The world was changing. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic thing like a volcano or an earthquake. It was slow. So slow, in fact, that Kale's family probably didn't even notice it at first. The changes were subtle, like a color slowly fading from a bright red to a dusty pink over thousands of years. The climate was getting drier, and the dense, lush forests that Kyle and his ancestors had called home for generations were starting to thin out. Patches of open grassland began to appear, small at first, like bald spots on a furry head. But they were growing. Theron, Kale's father, was the first to really sense it. His world was shrinking. The familiar green tunnels of the canopy, Their safe highways were becoming fragmented. The gaps between the trees were getting wider, forcing them to spend more time on the ground. The ground, with its strange smells and hidden dangers, was a place they usually avoided. But now it was a necessity. I imagined Theron would sit on a high branch, his brow furrowed, a low grumble in his chest. He was a creature of habit, and his habits were being challenged. He had a deep ancestral memory of the forest, a kind of inbuilt map that told him where to go and what to do. But now that map was full of blank spots. He would look out at the new open spaces, the sun beating down on the tall, dry grass, and he felt a kind of unease. It was a new world, and he wasn't sure what its rules were. For Cale, it was different. He was young. He didn't have the same deep-seated memories of the way things used to be. The open grasslands weren't a threat. They were an adventure. He was curious. When Theron and Lyra would hesitantly cross a patch of open ground, Kyle would run ahead, his small body a blur of excitement. He would leap and tumble in the dry grass, his eyes wide, taking in this new world. He discovered new smells, the scent of parched earth and a different kind of flower. He discovered new insects, big, crunchy beetles and buzzing grasshoppers that were a real treat. But there were also new dangers. One day, while Cale was playing, he heard a low hiss. He stopped dead in his tracks and looked down. Coiled in the grass was a large snake, its scales a beautiful pattern of brown and black. Cale had seen snakes before, but they were always in the trees, easy to spot. This one was perfectly camouflaged, a silent hunter waiting for a careless foot. His heart hammered in his chest. He froze, his small body trembling. Then Lyra was there. She let out a sharp, warning bark, and the snake, startled by the sudden noise, slithered away into the grass. Lyra scooped Cale up and held him close, her body a shield, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against his. That day, Cale learned that the open land was beautiful, but it was also unforgiving. Theron, seeing the incident, knew they had to adapt. They couldn't live in the trees anymore, not entirely. The new world demanded a new way of life. They had to become bipeds. They had to learn to walk on two legs. This wasn't a sudden change either. Apes even today can stand and walk for short distances. But for Ouranopithecus, it was becoming a necessity. Walking on two legs meant they could see over the tall grass, spotting both predators and food from a distance. It freed up their hands to carry things, like stones for cracking nuts or sticks for digging up roots. It was a clumsy process at first. Theron, with his powerful shoulders and long arms, found it awkward. He would lurch and sway, his knuckles occasionally scraping the ground for balance. But with each passing day, his movements became a little smoother, a little more confident. He taught Lyra, and together they taught Cale. Cale, with his smaller body and lighter frame, found it easier. He would wobble and fall, but he would always get back up, a look of determined concentration on his face. This new way of walking had another unexpected benefit. It changed their view of the world. When they were in the trees, their world was vertical. It was about up and down, about reaching for the next branch. But on the ground, their world was horizontal. It was about seeing across the plains, about covering long distances. Their focus shifted from the immediate surroundings to the horizon. It was a small change, but it was the start of something big. It was the start of a journey that would eventually lead to us. One of the most profound changes was in their diet. With the forest thinning, their favorite fruits were becoming scarcer. They had to learn to eat new things. They began to eat more of the tough, fibrous grasses and roots that grew in the open land. Their powerful jaws and strong teeth, which had always been used for grinding tough leaves, were perfectly suited for this new diet. Theron and Lyra taught Kyle to use sticks to dig for tasty roots and tubers, a new source of sustenance that was always available, even when the fruit trees were barren. They also started to hunt small animals, scuttling lizards and small mammals that were easy to catch. I imagine a scene one day where Theron, Lyra, and Kale are walking across the plains. They are moving with a newfound grace, their bodies swaying, with the rhythm of their two-legged gait. Theron stops, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He sees a herd of strange, four-legged animals, a new sight in this new world. They are big and powerful, but they are also a potential source of food. A low hum of thought begins in Theron's mind. He doesn't know it, but he's thinking in a new way, a way that his ancestors never had to. He's thinking about strategy, about a collective hunt. He's thinking like a leader, a provider in a changing world. The sun sets, painting the sky in fiery colors of orange and purple. The family huddles together on a high point, watching the stars begin to emerge, like tiny pinpricks of light in a black velvet cloth. They have survived another day. The world is different, more challenging, but they are adapting. They are not just surviving, they are evolving. This slow, steady march of change, this shift from the trees to the plains, from 4 legs to 2, from fruit to grass, was the story of Ouranopithecus. It was the story of a beginning. It's a story about a family who, without knowing it, were walking the first steps on a path that would lead to me, to you, to all of us. And that, I think, is the coolest story of all. The open grasslands, which had once felt like a strange and scary place, were now becoming home. The family of Ouranopithecus, my imagined family of Theron, Lyra, and Kyle, were getting good at this new way of life. They were becoming more efficient walkers, their bodies slowly adapting to the upright position. But the world kept changing. The dry spells were lasting longer, and the lush forests that remained were shrinking even more. It was like watching a big green blanket slowly get pulled away, revealing more and more of the dusty, golden earth beneath. This meant they had to travel farther to find food. A day of foraging was no longer a short trip from their sleeping tree. It became a long, purposeful journey. I imagined them moving as a unit, a little tribe. Theron would lead the way, his keen eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. Lyra and Kale would follow closely behind, their movements synchronized. They weren't just a family anymore. They were a small, mobile community. They were learning to rely on each other in a new way. One day they came across a new kind of challenge. A wide, shallow river blocked their path. The water was clear, and they could see the smooth, round stones on the bottom. But they had never crossed a river like this before. The water was a new element, a new kind of obstacle. Theron, being the leader, had to figure it out. He approached the edge cautiously, sniffing the air, his powerful brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't know it, but this was a test of his intelligence, of his ability to solve problems in a world full of new ones. He saw a group of strange birds on the other side, pecking at something on the ground. He knew there was food over there. But how to get across? He tried to wade in, but the smooth stones were slippery under his feet. He stumbled and fell, splashing water everywhere. Kyle, watching from the bank, let out a little bark of surprise. Theron got up, dripping wet, a look of frustration on his face. Then I imagine him seeing something that changed everything. A large log, uprooted by a past flood, was stuck on the riverbank. It was big and heavy, and it stretched halfway across the river, like a bridge waiting to be used. Theron looked at the log, then at the other side, then back at the log. A flicker of something new appeared in his eyes. It was a spark of an idea. He didn't just see a log, he saw a tool. Using all his strength, he pushed the log with his powerful hands and feet, inching it slowly closer to the other side. It was a struggle, a battle against the water and the mud. But he was determined. He was solving a problem. Finally, the log settled, a little wobbly but solid enough. Theron tested it with his weight, and then, with a low call to his family, he walked across. Lyra followed, and Kale, a little nervous at first, scampered across after them. They had crossed the river. They had used a tool. This was a huge deal. My dad told me that the use of tools is one of the things that separates us from other animals. I'd always thought of tools as things you made, like a spear or a hammer. But Theron didn't make the log. He just used it. He used his brain to see a solution where there wasn't one before. This was the beginning of something important. It was the birth of an idea. On the other side of the river, they found a different kind of bounty. The open grasslands stretched out before them, but they were dotted with small, hardy trees that bore a new kind of fruit. It wasn't as sweet as the forest fruits, but it was nourishing. And they found something else, something that would change their diet forever. Scattered across the ground were hard, round nuts, protected by a tough outer shell. They were a challenge to open. Theron tried to crack them with his strong teeth, but he couldn't. His teeth were powerful, but they weren't hammers. Lyra had an idea. She remembered how she had taught Kale to use a stone to crack open nuts back in the forest. She picked up a smooth, heavy stone from the riverbank and placed a nut on a flat rock. Then, with a quick, practiced motion, she brought the stone down, and with a satisfying crack, the nut broke open, revealing the tasty prize inside. Cal, watching, did the same. He found his own stone, a little one that fit perfectly in his small hand, and copied his mother. The family sat there, on the bank of the river, cracking nuts with their stones. It was a simple scene, a family eating a meal, but it was also so much more. They were using tools. They were adapting, not just physically, but mentally. They were solving problems, and in doing so, they were changing their own destiny. They were pushing the boundaries of what it meant to be an ape. As the sun set, casting long, strange shadows across the open land, Kyle looked at his parents. He saw his father, Theron, a powerful protective figure who had just used a log to cross a river. He saw his mother, Lyra, a smart, resourceful creature who had taught him how to use a stone to get food. He saw them as something more than just his parents. He saw them as leaders, as teachers, as pioneers. The world was getting harder, but they were getting smarter. The challenges were bigger, but their solutions were more creative. The Ouranopithecus family wasn't just surviving anymore. They were thriving. They were learning, and that, I think, is the most important part of the story. It's the moment when a species stops just living and starts learning. It's the moment when a simple family on the plains of a world long forgotten takes the first small but incredibly important steps toward a future they could never have dreamed of. The seasons kept turning, each one a little drier than the last. The sun was a relentless eye in the sky, and the open plains shimmered with heat. The small family of Ouranopithecus, Theron, Lyra, and Kale, was no longer alone. They had joined a larger group, a tribe, a community. The pressures of the changing world had forced them together. Safety in numbers was no longer just a good idea. It was a necessity. This new life was different. It was loud. Where Kale had once only heard the familiar sounds of his parents, he now heard the low grumbles, the sharp barks, and the playful hoots of dozens of other apes. He met others his own age, and they spent their days in a chaotic mix of learning and play. They chased each other through the tall grass, practicing their two-legged running. They wrestled and tumbled, building their strength and learning the social rules of their new group. The tribe was led by a powerful male named Orion. I call him Orion because he was like a star, a constant guiding presence. He wasn't just the strongest. He was the wisest. He was the one who decided where they would travel, where they would find food, and where they would spend the night. His authority was unspoken, a quiet understanding that everyone followed his lead. Theron, Kale's father, respected Orion. They weren't rivals. They were allies. They were two leaders in a world that needed many. One of the most important things about living in a group was communication. The Ouranopithecus had always used sounds to communicate, but now the language of the tribe was becoming more complex. It wasn't just a simple warning bark or a contented grumble. There were different hoots and calls for different things. A high-pitched squeal meant there was a predator, but the sound was different if the predator was a big cat on the ground or a huge bird of prey in the sky. There was a specific call for finding a new food source, a sound that meant, "Follow me." This new complexity of sound was like the first tiny sparks of a fire that would one day become a roaring flame. One afternoon, a young member of the tribe, a little girl I named Alara, got too close to a thorny bush. A sharp thorn pierced her foot, and she let out a cry of pain. The tribe stopped, their heads turning. The sound was new. It wasn't a warning of a predator or a call for food. It was a cry for help. Lyra, Kyle's mother, and several other females rushed to Alara's side. They sniffed her wound, their faces full of concern. They licked the wound clean, and one of the older females, a wise ape with a graying face, crushed some leaves between her teeth and applied them to the cut. The leaves, I imagine, had some kind of soothing property. The wound was treated and the tribe moved on, but not before they all took a moment to check on Alara. It was a moment of shared empathy, of community care. They weren't just a collection of individuals. They were a family. They were a society in its most basic form. The days were still a constant search for food and water. The plains, while a new source of sustenance, were not as generous as the forests. They had to be clever. The use of stones for cracking nuts became a common practice. They also began to use sticks to dig for roots, and sometimes Theron and Orion would work together, using their strength to snap a branch off a tree and use it to hit a tough fruit, knocking it down from a high branch. They were working together, problem-solving in a group. Their nights were spent in a collective sleeping spot, a high plateau of rock or a sturdy clump of trees. They would huddle together for warmth and safety. Kyle would often fall asleep to the sound of his tribe, a low chorus of sleepy grumbles and soft breathing. He felt safe there, surrounded by his own kind. He knew that if a predator approached, there would be many eyes watching, many voices to raise the alarm. But the biggest change was a new kind of awareness. Living in a group meant they were not just thinking about themselves. They were thinking about the group. When a male found a ripe fruit tree, he didn't eat it all himself. He let out a hoot, and the rest of the tribe came to share. When a mother found a particularly good foraging spot, she led the other mothers there. They were learning the concepts of sharing, of cooperation, of community. They were learning what it meant to be a part of something bigger than themselves. Life was harder in some ways, but it was also richer. The challenges were bigger, but the support was greater. The Ouranopithecus tribe, under the relentless pressure of a changing world, was being forged into a new kind of social creature. They were learning to walk on two legs, to use tools, and to communicate in new, more complex ways. But most importantly, they were learning to live together, to care for each other, and to work as a team. This was the birth of culture. It was the moment when a group of apes became a community, and that, I believe, is one of the most beautiful and important parts of the story. The tribe of Ouranopithecus continued to thrive, but the world around them was getting colder. The seasons weren't just drier anymore. They were harsher. The days were still hot, but the nights were now a different kind of cold, a biting chill that made them huddle together even tighter. The once abundant plains were becoming sparse, and the tribe had to move more often, a constant journey in search of food and water. This change was a test of their endurance, a new kind of challenge that pushed them to be smarter and more resourceful. One day, while the tribe was foraging, Kale and his friends discovered something strange. They were playing near a rocky outcrop when they saw a dark, smoldering patch on the ground. A nearby tree was scorched black. They approached it cautiously, sniffing the air. The smell was unique. Not like a predator, not like a plant. It was a hot, smoky scent. One of the other. Young apes, a curious and bold male I call Ryan, poked the black earth with a stick. It was warm to the touch. They looked up and saw a column of smoke rising from a distant hill. It was a natural fire, started by lightning. The tribe had always been afraid of fire. It was a destructive force, a roaring monster that burned away their home. But this time, something was different. The fire was far away, and the smell it left behind was interesting, not scary. Orion, the wise leader, came to investigate. He looked at the scorched earth, at the black tree, and his brow furrowed in thought. He didn't run away. He was curious. He looked at the distant smoke, and a low, thoughtful grumble rumbled in his chest. Later that night, the cold was particularly brutal. The wind howled across the plains, and the tribe shivered together, their fur not enough to keep them warm. Kale felt his teeth chattering. He looked at his father, Theron, who was huddled with Lyra, trying to keep her warm. Theron looked up at the moon, then at the distant glow of the fire on the hill. An idea, a crazy, new idea, was forming in his mind. The next day, Theron and Orion led a small group, including Lyra and a few other brave members, toward the fire. Kale watched them go, his heart a mixture of fear and excitement. He had never seen his father do something so risky. They didn't go close to the flames. They approached the edge of the burned-out area, where the fire had already consumed everything, and was now just a collection of smoldering logs and warm ashes. They were careful, wary of the heat. Theron used a sturdy stick, a long one that he had been carrying, to cautiously poke at a log. A piece of wood, still glowing with a faint orange, light broke off. Theron looked at the glowing stick, then at his cold hands. He realized that this was not just a destructive force. It was a tool. It was warmth. He carefully picked up a glowing stick, holding it far away from his body. It was hot, but it wasn't dangerous if he was careful. The other apes watched in silent wonder. Lyra, with her quick and clever mind, saw the potential immediately. She took a glowing stick from Theron, and together they carried it back to their sleeping spot. That night was different. The tribe huddled around the glowing logs, the heat radiating out, a warm, comforting blanket against the cold. The fire also kept the predators away. The saber-toothed cats, who were always a threat in the darkness, were afraid of the light and the strange, smoky smell. They stayed far away, their eyes glowing in the darkness, but they never came close. The discovery of fire changed everything. It was a turning point, a monumental leap in their evolution. They had warmth, which meant they could survive colder nights and expand into new territories. They had protection, which meant they could sleep more soundly and be less fearful. But, most importantly, they had a new center for their community. The fire wasn't just a tool, it was a gathering place. They would sit around the fire at night, the flickering light dancing on their faces, the low grumbles and hoots of conversation filling the air. This was the birth of a new kind of social interaction. The fire was a stage for storytelling, for sharing. It was a place for teaching the young ones about the day's dangers and discoveries. It was a place where a family, a tribe, could truly become a community, bound not just by necessity, but by a shared comfort and a shared light in the darkness. Kyle, sitting next to his mother, felt the warmth on his face and looked at his father, Theron, who was carefully adding a new stick to the fire. He saw a leader, a pioneer, a creature who had not just survived, but had dared to take a new path, to take a dangerous element and make it their own. It was a moment of true genius, the kind of genius that separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom. The discovery of fire had changed everything, but the greatest changes were happening inside the tribe. The fire wasn't just a source of heat and protection, it became a catalyst for something entirely new. Around the flickering flames, they began to share things in a way they never had before. They didn't just share food, they shared knowledge. I imagine Theron, my made-up Ouranopithecus father, sitting by the fire with Kyle and the other young ones. He's not just sitting there. He's teaching. He would pick up a smooth, heavy stone, the kind they used for cracking nuts, and demonstrate how to hold it just right, how to hit the nut with the perfect angle to get the prize inside without crushing it. This wasn't just a physical skill. It was a lesson, passed from one generation to the next. The firelight made the lesson feel more important, a ritual of learning. This kind of teaching, this deliberate sharing of skills, was a massive step. It meant that the tribe wasn't just relying on instinct anymore. They were building a bank of shared knowledge, a collective memory of what worked and what didn't. They were becoming smarter together. One evening, I imagined a new kind of interaction taking place around the fire. A young ape, maybe a friend of Kale's named Zuri, found a particularly juicy root that day. She was so excited that she started to reenact the discovery. She would use her hands to mimic digging in the ground. Then, she'd show how she pulled out the root and bit into it, a look of pure joy on her face. The other apes watched, and a few of them started to make a low humming sound, almost like a laugh. They were understanding her story. This wasn't just a noise. It was communication on a deeper level. It was the birth of storytelling. This new ability to tell stories, even without complex words, was a huge deal. It meant they could share information about things that weren't happening right now. They could warn others about a dangerous place they had seen, or tell them about a new patch of berries. This was the beginning of what we would call culture. It was the start of a shared history. The fire also changed their relationship with food. Before, they ate everything raw, but one day, a piece of meat from a small animal they had hunted fell into the fire. It cooked, and the smell was different, better. The meat was softer and easier to chew. This was a new discovery. My dad told me that cooking food is another thing that made us human. It made food safer and easier to digest, which meant our guts got smaller and our brains got bigger. The Ouranopithecus weren't cooking meals like we do, but they were learning. That fire could be used for more than just warmth. It could be used to transform their world, to make their food better. I picture a scene where Theron and Lyra are sharing a cooked piece of meat with Kale. The meat is soft and delicious. The family is sitting together, not just eating, but sharing a meal. The act of eating together, around a fire, became a social event. It brought them closer. The world outside the firelight was still full of danger. The cold was a constant threat, and the predators were always a lurking presence. But inside the circle of firelight, they had a space that was safe, warm, and full of possibility. They were no longer just reacting to the world. They were beginning to shape it. They were taking control. They were learning, teaching, and telling stories. This was the quiet revolution. It wasn't a sudden war or a big discovery like a new planet. It was a slow, steady change, a little spark of an idea that was passed from one ape to the next, growing bigger with each passing generation. The Ouranopithecus were no longer just a group of apes surviving on the plains. They were becoming a community, a society, a family with a shared history and a shared future. And it all started with a simple flame. The world continued its slow, inexorable march of change. The Ouranopithecus tribe, now masters of fire and story, had reached a new level of existence. But the environmental pressures didn't stop. The land became even more arid, and the seasons became a brutal cycle of endless heat and bitter cold. The grasslands, once a new and exciting frontier, were now a difficult home. The tribe had to become even more adaptable. I imagine a time when the tribe's food sources became scarce. The fruits were gone, and the small animals they hunted were few and far between. The tribe was hungry. Kale, now a strong, young adult, was beginning to feel the weight of this responsibility. He was no longer just a learner, he was a provider. He and his father, Theron, would spend their days scouring the land, but often they came back with nothing. The low growls of hunger were a constant backdrop to their lives. This scarcity forced them to think in a new way. They had to become more efficient hunters. Instead of just chasing a small animal and hoping to catch it, they started to work together in a coordinated way. I imagine Theron leading a group of males, including Kale, in a silent hunt. They would use their superior vision to spot a herd of a new kind of animal, a type of ancient deer, in the distance. Instead of just charging, they would use strategy. Some of the apes would create a loud noise, a distraction, while others would sneak around, herding the animals toward a natural trap, like a narrow ravine or a rocky dead end. This was a new level of cooperation. It wasn't just working together to move a log, it was a complex, coordinated effort with a shared goal. It required a level of communication that went beyond simple calls. It required trust and a shared understanding of the plan. This was the birth of teamwork. It was a skill that would eventually lead to us. The tribe's relationship with tools also evolved. The stones they used for cracking nuts became more than just simple rocks. They started to look for specific shapes, specific weights. They would spend time picking through piles of stones, looking for the perfect one. I imagine Kale sitting by the fire, carefully examining a stone, trying to find the one with the sharpest edge, the best grip. They weren't just using tools anymore. They were selecting them. This was the first step toward creating them. The tribe also learned a new way to use fire. One cold morning, a young ape, I'll call her Leah, found a hollowed-out log that had been burned by the fire. The inside was smooth and black, but the outside was a sturdy, unburned shell. She realized that she could use this to carry water. The tribe was always in search of water, and this was a game changer. The burned log became a container, a way to transport a precious resource. This was a new kind of ingenuity, a new way of seeing the world. A burned log wasn't just a burnt log, it was a bucket. A sharp stone wasn't just a sharp stone, it was a knife. The world was full of new possibilities if you just knew how to look. The social structure of the tribe also grew, more complex. With the added stresses of a challenging environment, the community relied on a new kind of leadership. Orion was still a wise leader, but now there were others who took on different roles. Lyra and the other females became the teachers, the ones who passed on the skills of tool selection and food preparation to the young. Theron and the other males were the protectors and the hunters. The tribe was no longer just a collection of individuals. It was a functioning society with different roles and responsibilities. This was a crucial step in their evolution. The days were long, the nights were cold, and the hunt for food was a constant struggle. But the Ouranopithecus tribe, through their collective intelligence, their new tools, and their sophisticated social structure was not just surviving, they were adapting and evolving. They were taking the first steps down a path that would lead to a creature that could not only survive in this world, but also understand it, and eventually shape it. They were the ancestors, the beginning of a story that would one day lead to us. And that, I think, is a beautiful and incredible thing to think about.